origins of a cosmic rivalry in the years following World War II. The world did not fully understand the magnitude of what had been unleashed. The atomic bomb had ended the war, but it began something far more dangerous, a new era defined by fear, suspicion, and the relentless pursuit of technological supremacy. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged from the ashes of global conflict as superpowers, each convinced that the other sought nothing less than total dominance. Borders were redrawn, nations divided, alliances formed, and behind every smiling political handshake was a silent calculation of power. The Cold War did not begin with rockets. It began with ideology. The United States believed democracy and capitalism were the path to human progress, while the Soviet Union viewed communism as the inevitable future for all nations. Two visions for the world collided, and neither side intended to compromise. Tension spread into every corner of society, politics, culture, military strategy, and eventually the heavens. The seeds of the space race were planted quietly, long before Sputnik, long before astronauts or cosmonauts were household names. During the final months of World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled through the ruins of Germany, searching for secret laboratories, blueprints, equipment, and most importantly, Germany's Saturn V rocket program had demonstrated for the first time that space was no longer a dream. It was a battlefield waiting to happen. The Allies saw the future in those rockets, and they wanted control. Operation Paperclip, the American effort to bring German scientists to the US, changed everything. The most significant recruit was Wernher von Braun, the brilliant and controversial architect of the V2 program. Von Braun had a vision of space travel long before he worked for the Nazis, and he believed rockets could carry humanity beyond Earth. When he arrived in America, he brought with him not just knowledge but ambition. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union captured its own teams of German specialists, assembling them in isolated research centers deep within Soviet territory. The world did not know it yet, but these captured minds would define the next quarter-century of geopolitical competition. After the war, both nations focused on rebuilding, but beneath the surface a new arms race was forming. The United States developed nuclear weapons of unimaginable destructive power. The Soviet Union, determined not to be overshadowed, tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. The balance of global power shifted instantly. Neither side trusted the other. Each feared the consequences of falling behind. Every advancement in military technology became a symbol of national strength. By the early 1950s, rockets began taking center stage. Long-range missiles were no longer science fiction, they were the future of warfare. A missile capable of crossing continents could deliver a nuclear warhead faster than any plane. The race to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs) pushed scientists to advance propulsion, guidance, and fuel systems at a rapid pace. But there was something else these rockets could do. They could place objects into orbit. In 1955, both the United States and the Soviet Union announced plans to launch artificial satellites. During the International Geophysical Year, for the first time, space was openly declared as the next frontier. Yet the United States, confident in its technological superiority, underestimated the Soviets. American leaders believed the USSR lacked the industrial capacity and scientific foundation to beat them. They were wrong. Behind the Iron Curtain, a quiet genius named Sergei Korolev led the Soviet rocket program. Known only by the title Chief Designer, Korolev was a visionary. He had endured imprisonment in Stalin's brutal labor camps, survived torture, and returned determined to push the boundaries of engineering. He had one goal: to prove that the Soviet Union could surpass the United States in space. While American rocket tests repeatedly failed, Soviet engineers worked in absolute secrecy. There were no press conferences, no televised launches, no public failures. Everything that went wrong was hidden. Everything that went right was celebrated only when success was undeniable. Korolev built the R-7 rocket, a machine so powerful and advanced that Western analysts refused to believe it existed. It was capable of launching a nuclear warhead across continents, but it could also launch a satellite. On October 4, 1957, the world changed. A tiny metal sphere, no bigger than a beach ball, soared into the night sky and began circling the Earth. It transmitted a simple, repetitive signal: beep, beep, beep. That sound traveled across radio towers into living rooms and deep into the American psyche. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It was a scientific achievement, but to Americans it sounded like an alarm bell. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch a missile. If they could reach orbit, they could reach anywhere on Earth. Panic spread across the United States. Headlines screamed about technological failure and national humiliation. Politicians demanded answers. Parents worried about their children's future. American scientists felt betrayed by years of inadequate funding. The confidence of a nation had been shaken by a sphere that weighed less than 200 pounds. The Soviet Union celebrated Sputnik had done more than orbit Earth. It had shattered the illusion of American superiority. Newspapers around the world printed images of Korolev's triumph. The USSR claimed it had proven the power of socialism. Crowds marched in Moscow. Khrushchev laughed at American panic. The Cold War had shifted into a new arena, one that was vast, unpredictable, and filled with unknown dangers. 1 month later, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying Laika, the first living creature, into space. The United States was still struggling to get a rocket off the launch pad. American attempts exploded on national television, further damaging confidence. What had begun as a symbolic competition had become a global crisis of prestige, military might, and ideological supremacy. The space race was officially on. Governments, scientists, engineers, and military leaders now understood the stakes. Space was not merely a frontier of curiosity. It was a battlefield. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the future. The Soviet Union had seized the high ground first, and the United States was scrambling to catch up. This new arena demanded innovation, courage, and relentless ambition. It demanded sacrifices the world had yet to understand. As the 1960s approached, the space race was no longer about satellites. It was about humanity's destiny, and the battle to control that destiny was only beginning. America's crisis of confidence, the shock of Sputnik, did not fade. It spread like a slow-moving earthquake, shaking the foundations of American society. Newspapers printed headlines that sounded like warnings of war. Politicians stood in Congress pounding their fists on wooden desks, demanding accountability. Parents questioned what kind of world their children would inherit. For the first time in its modern history, the United States felt vulnerable. If the Soviets could dominate the skies, what else could they dominate? If they could reach space, could they place weapons above American cities? Fear became the silent fuel behind every decision in Washington. This was not simply a technological setback, it was a psychological catastrophe. The United States had always believed itself to be the center of innovation, the leader of the free world, the nation with the brightest minds and the boldest ideas. Sputnik cracked that belief open. It revealed something deeper, something uncomfortable. America had become complacent. Years of political confidence had created scientific neglect. Congress had cut research funding. Universities struggled for grants. Engineering was no longer viewed as a heroic profession. Now, that neglect was coming back to haunt them. While Americans debated how to respond, the Soviet Union continued its relentless march forward. In November 1957, Sputnik 2 carried Laika, a stray dog from Moscow's streets, into orbit. Laika became a symbol not of scientific progress but of Soviet boldness. They had moved from machines to living beings in just 1 month. The United States had still not succeeded in launching even a small satellite. Every failure broadcast on live television deepened the national embarrassment. Each explosion destroyed not just hardware but public confidence. The panic inside Washington grew. Congressional committees met daily. Intelligence agencies sent reports warning that Soviet missiles could reach the United States without warning. Military leaders demanded immediate action. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, but deeply concerned, recognized the need for a major shift. The nation had underestimated the Soviet Union. It could no longer afford to do so. Eisenhower ordered the formation of a new, unified civilian space agency that would coordinate all national space efforts. On July 29, 1958, he signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. With the stroke of a pen, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration (NASA) was born. But NASA did not emerge as a polished institution. It came together from scattered parts. Bits of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, fragments of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, proponents of the Navy's Vanguard program, and clusters of university research labs. It was, at first, a patchwork organization trying to find its identity. The responsibilities were immense. NASA had to unify competing military branches, recruit thousands of engineers, design rockets from scratch, establish mission protocols, build launch facilities, create astronaut training programs, and reassure a shaken nation that the United States could still lead the world. All of this had to be done while the Soviet Union continued its advances. The early months were chaotic. Scientists argued over the direction of the program. Some favored robotic exploration, while others insisted the future demanded human spaceflight. Politicians pressured NASA for quick results to restore national pride. The military wanted dual-use technologies for defense. Universities wanted research freedom. No one agreed on priorities. But there was one shared understanding. America had to catch up immediately. Inside NASA, the urgency intensified. Eisenhower approved Project Mercury, America's first manned space program. Its goal was ambitious: put a human in orbit before the Soviets. 7 military test pilots were selected as the first astronauts. The Mercury 7. Their training was relentless. They endured centrifuges, vacuum chambers, jungle survival courses, altitude tests, and endless medical evaluations. The astronauts quickly became national celebrity symbols of American resilience. But behind the scenes, the Mercury program struggled. Rockets exploded on test stands. Capsules suffered parachute failures. Astronaut escape systems misfired. Every problem delayed progress, and every delay gave the Soviets more time. The pressure on NASA scientists became overwhelming. They worked nights, weekends, holidays. Families barely saw them. Mistakes meant lost time, and lost time meant national humiliation. A sense of desperation settled over the agency. America needed a breakthrough, and it needed it fast. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued surprising the world. In 1959, they launched Luna 1, the first spacecraft to escape Earth's gravitational pull. Later that year, Luna 2 struck the Moon, becoming the first human-made object to reach another celestial body. And then Luna 3 returned the first photographs of the far side of the Moon, images humanity had never seen. Each Soviet success felt like a hammer striking the American ego. Each achievement widened the perception gap between the two nations. The United States felt as if it were running uphill while the Soviets sprinted ahead. By 1960, the situation was critical. America had not yet put a person in space. The Soviets were preparing for a manned mission. Intelligence briefings indicated that the USSR could launch a cosmonaut into orbit at any moment. The fear was that the next Soviet announcement would claim the most important first of all, the first human in space. As the calendar approached 1961, the tension inside NASA became unbearable. Engineers whispered that the United States was on the verge of losing the space race completely. Military officials warned that losing the high ground in space meant losing global influence. The White House prepared for the worst. The world was waiting for the next seismic moment. And in April 1961, it arrived, changing history forever. The intelligence war, the space race, was no longer merely a technological contest. It evolved into a shadow conflict where intelligence agencies fought behind closed doors, in silent rooms lit by dim lamps, with documents marked top secret and decisions that shaped the course of history. By the early 1960s, the Soviet Union and the United States understood that whoever controlled information would control the future of space. Rockets carried astronauts, but intelligence carried nations. The United States entered this stage with fear that the Soviets held a decisive advantage. The launch of Sputnik had proven that the Soviet Union could outpace expectations. American leaders wanted to know how they had fallen behind, and how far ahead the Soviets truly were. Yet the USSR's secrecy was nearly impenetrable. Everything visible to the world was carefully curated. Every failure was erased. Every success was amplified. If America wanted answers, it had to steal them. The CIA began using high-altitude U-2 reconnaissance planes to gather photographic intelligence from deep inside Soviet territory. For a time, these missions provided valuable glimpses into launch pads, missile development sites, and test facilities. But in 1960, the Soviets shot down a U-2 and captured pilot Francis Gary Powers alive. The incident humiliated the United States on the global stage. prove that the USSR could defend its airspace and shut down aerial intelligence operations. America needed a new approach, one that could observe Soviet secrets without crossing their borders. That approach came in the form of spy satellites. The Corona program placed cameras into orbit, snapping photographs of Soviet installations and returning the film to Earth in re-entry capsules that were caught mid-air by aircraft. These snapshots revealed details previously unimaginable: the number of Soviet test stands, the size of their rockets, the scale of their fuel operations, the patterns of their launches. America learned that some of its fears were exaggerated. There was no massive missile gap. The Soviets were formidable, but not invincible. Still, their ability to produce surprise breakthroughs remained deeply troubling. While the CIA observed from orbit, the KGB infiltrated from within. Soviet intelligence targeted American universities, aerospace companies, and research facilities. Agents disguised as diplomats, scientists, or exchange students approached vulnerable individuals and attempted to extract secrets. They used bribery, flattery, ideological manipulation, and sometimes threats. They wanted blueprints of rockets, data on guidance systems, insights into mission planning, and information about astronaut training. Anything that could accelerate their progress or slow America's was considered invaluable. Some American workers, motivated by money or disillusionment, provided classified materials. Others resisted but found themselves pressured or tricked. The Soviets were especially interested in NASA, though the agency was more transparent than Soviet institutions. The openness of American science allowed the USSR to gather plenty of information legally through conferences, publications, and televised broadcasts. But they still needed covert intel to fill in the blanks. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union conducted its own disinformation campaigns. They built decoys, false test structures, dummy rockets, inflated numbers that tricked American analysts. They broadcast misleading radio signals. They staged activity at launch sites purely to confuse satellite surveillance. These tactics worked. At times, American intelligence believed the Soviets were closer to landing a man on the moon than they truly were. This pressure forced NASA to accelerate its own timeline, sometimes dangerously. The CIA's most valuable asset in the Soviet Union was Oleg Penkovsky, a military intelligence officer who became disillusioned with his government. Penkovsky secretly provided the CIA and MI6 with documents detailing the weaknesses of Soviet missile systems, the limited reliability of their rockets, and the disorganization inside their space program. His information painted a clearer picture of Soviet vulnerabilities and helped America understand the real balance of power. But in 1962, the KGB discovered his betrayal. Penkovsky was arrested, interrogated, and eventually executed. His loss was devastating, but his intelligence had already shifted the accuracy of American assessments. The rivalry escalated during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Satellite images revealed Soviet missile installations in Cuba. The tension between the superpowers nearly resulted in nuclear war. The space race and the intelligence war became inseparable. Surveillance technology built to observe space now monitored Earth, and the fate of humanity depended on information more than firepower. After the crisis, both nations accelerated their space programs with renewed determination. Space was no longer symbolic, it was strategic. Espionage extended beyond machines and documents. It targeted individuals. Both the CIA and the KGB attempted to recruit scientists, engineers, and even astronauts. Any hint of dissatisfaction or vulnerability became an opportunity. The Soviets feared American sabotage and kept their facilities heavily guarded. The United States feared Soviet infiltration and tightened security at NASA. Trust became rare. Every phone call, every meeting, every foreign visitor was scrutinized. The KGB hid Soviet space failures with brutal efficiency. Explosions, malfunctioning rockets, and fatal accidents were covered up instantly. Some Western radio operators claimed to intercept dying transmissions from cosmonauts. Stranded and failing spacecraft voices pleading for help, heartbeat monitors fading. These claims were never confirmed, but they fueled rumors of lost cosmonauts erased from Soviet history. What is known for certain is that several missions ended in tragedy long before Gagarin's success, but no mention of them appeared in Soviet newspapers. American intelligence did uncover evidence of catastrophic Soviet mishaps. Corona images revealed launch pads damaged by explosions. Intercepted signals hinted at emergency procedures. The death of Valentin Bondarenko in a ground training accident was concealed for decades. These tragedies reflected the intense pressure Soviet engineers faced. The USSR was determined to win the space race, but the cost was high, and the truth was forbidden. At the same time, The United States faced its own failures openly. Every American rocket explosion was televised. Every setback was analyzed in newspapers. This transparency made the US look weaker, but it provided scientists with valuable feedback and prevented the stagnation caused by fear of punishment. The CIA noticed the difference. American openness encouraged innovation, while Soviet secrecy produced fear-driven engineering that hid mistakes rather than solved them. By 1965, the intelligence war reached a turning point. The CIA concluded that the Soviet Union, though capable of dramatic achievements, was struggling internally. The death of Sergei Korolev in 1966 further weakened their space program. Without his leadership, Soviet progress slowed dramatically. The United States, though behind in the early years, was now catching up with focused determination and enormous resources. Both sides continued gathering intelligence, but the balance had shifted. America had gained enough insight to realize that the moon was within its grasp. The Soviet Union was still a competitor, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it once appeared to be. The intelligence war had shaped the space race, pushing both nations to extremes. Information had become the most valuable fuel. Secrets were traded like weapons. Every launch, every test, every failure was part of a much larger game, a game fought in silence, beneath the surface of public celebration, where the fate of the space race was decided long before humans touched the moon. Kennedy's gamble. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in January 1961, he inherited a nation shaken by fear and humiliation. The Soviet Union had placed the first satellite into orbit, had sent the first living creature into space, and was rumored to be preparing a manned mission. American failures had been displayed on television screens across the world, and the new president understood that the technological competition had become a test of national strength. The United States could not afford another loss. Kennedy was young, charismatic, and politically aware of the symbolic importance of global leadership. His advisors briefed him daily on Soviet advances, each report sounding more alarming than the last. The intelligence community warned that the Soviets might soon send the first human into space. Kennedy asked if America could beat them. The answer was no. The United States was months, perhaps years, behind. Kennedy felt the weight of history closing in on him. On April 12, 1961, the news shattered whatever hope remained. Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old Soviet Air Force pilot, had become the first human to orbit the Earth. His smiling face appeared on every newspaper. His name echoed in every capital. For the second time in 4 years, the Soviets had achieved a world-changing milestone before the United States. Kennedy recognized the severity of this moment. The Soviet Union had not just achieved a technical victory, they had seized the global imagination. America reacted with shock, frustration, and anxiety. Politicians accused NASA of incompetence. Newspapers questioned whether democracy could compete with communism. Citizens wondered if America was falling behind permanently. Kennedy realized that restoring national confidence required more than incremental progress. It demanded a bold vision, something so daring that achieving it would instantly restore prestige, and failing to achieve it would be catastrophic. Kennedy convened his top advisors: Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, NASA Administrator James Webb, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and leading scientists gathered to discuss the future of America's space program. Kennedy asked one straightforward question: what could the United States do that the Soviet Union could not beat them to? Silence filled the room. Eventually, Johnson spoke: land a man on the moon. The idea seemed outrageous. NASA had not yet put a single person into orbit. The Mercury program was still in its infancy. The technology required for a lunar landing was far beyond anything yet built. Kennedy pressed for analysis. How much would it cost? How long would it take? Could the nation realistically achieve it? The answers were grim. It would cost billions of dollars, strain national budgets, require unprecedented engineering breakthroughs, and risk human lives. But it was also technically possible. Valley NASA officials estimated it could be done by the end of the decade if the country committed every necessary resource. Kennedy weighed the decision carefully. The Cold War was not only a military or political struggle, it was a struggle for the future of humanity. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech was firm, confident, and visionary. He declared that the United States should commit itself to achieving the goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade ended. His words stunned the room. The moon, visible to every person on Earth, became a destination that symbolized human ambition. If the United States could reach it, nothing was impossible. Inside NASA, the announcement triggered a whirlwind. Engineers scrambled to design new rockets. Scientists debated mission profiles. Astronauts trained for missions that had yet to be clearly defined. The agency faced immense challenges. It needed a heavy-lift rocket far more powerful than anything ever built. It needed a spacecraft capable of navigating deep space. It needed guidance computers, communication systems, landing modules, heat shields, life support systems, and procedures for every stage of the mission. NASA had to expand rapidly. New facilities were built in Texas, Florida, and Alabama. Thousands of new engineers were hired. Contractors across the country received enormous budgets to develop components. Von Braun's team in Huntsville began designing the Saturn series of rockets, machines that would dwarf all previous achievements in propulsion. The scope of the effort was unprecedented. Entire industries were shaped around the goal of reaching the moon. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union watched with caution. Khrushchev mocked Kennedy's announcement publicly, calling it a fantasy. But internally, Soviet engineers took it seriously. They began planning their own lunar program, knowing that the next great victory in the space race would redefine the balance of power. The rivalry intensified as each nation sought to outdo the other, not only on the launch pad but also in the hearts and minds of the world. NASA pushed forward with determination. The Mercury program continued, culminating in Alan Shepard's suborbital flight just weeks after Gagarin's mission. Though less ambitious, it restored some pride. The United States would soon follow with orbital missions. Step by step, the nation began building momentum that would eventually carry it into the Apollo era. Kennedy's gamble extended beyond the practical. He believed deeply in the symbolic value of exploration. In 1962, at Rice University, he delivered one of the most iconic speeches in American history. He reminded the nation that the moon challenge was not chosen because it was easy, but because it was hard. That difficulty would organize and measure the best of American energy and skills. His words ignited new enthusiasm across the country and gave NASA the moral authority to continue pushing forward. Yet the risks remained immense. A single catastrophic failure could destroy the entire program, and the clock was ticking. Every day brought new pressure. Every delay threatened the deadline. But Kennedy had made his choice. He had placed the nation on a path with no retreat. As the early 1960s progressed, the space race transformed into a national mission unlike anything America had ever undertaken. Kennedy's gamble had reshaped the trajectory of science, technology, and human ambition, and Moon stood waiting, silent and distant, as both superpowers prepared for the greatest race in the history of civilization. The road to Apollo, the path to the moon, was not a straight line. It was a long, winding ascent shaped by trial, error, and the relentless determination to transform theory into reality. After Kennedy committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade's end, NASA faced the monumental task of turning that bold declaration into an achievable sequence of missions. The early 1960s became a period of intense experimentation. Every decision carried weight. Every failure carried consequences. The journey toward Apollo demanded precision on a scale humanity had never attempted. The first major phase was Project Mercury, which had begun before Kennedy's announcement but now carried new urgency. Mercury's purpose was to prove that human beings could survive spaceflight and that spacecraft could function reliably in orbit. Alan Shepard's suborbital flight in May 1961 restored a measure of national confidence, but the Soviet Union still held the lead with Gagarin's full orbit. NASA needed to match that achievement quickly. It did so when John Glenn orbited Earth 3 times in February 1962. Glenn's successful flight became a turning point for the United States. It reassured the public that America could compete. But NASA leaders knew that Mercury was only the first step. Mercury capsules were extremely small, with limited maneuverability and virtually no room for meaningful operations. They could take humans into space, but they could not take humans to the moon. NASA needed something far more complex. That next step was Project Gemini. Gemini's purpose was to test the critical components necessary for lunar missions: spacewalks, long-duration flights, rendezvous, and docking. These were not optional abilities. To land on the moon, astronauts would need to leave their spacecraft, operate outside in vacuum conditions, travel for extended periods, and connect to vehicles in orbit with precision. Gemini began in 1965 with Gemini 3, crewed by Gus Grissom and John Young. The mission tested maneuverability and re-entry techniques. Each Gemini mission built upon the last. Gemini 4 featured the first American spacewalk. Gemini 5 proved that spacecraft could remain in orbit for over a week. Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 executed the first controlled rendezvous between two spacecraft. Gemini 8 performed the first successful docking, though the mission nearly ended in disaster when a stuck thruster sent the spacecraft into a violent spin. Neil Armstrong, demonstrating calm under pressure, regained control and saved the crew. Every lesson from these missions became vital knowledge. Every error revealed something NASA had to correct before Apollo. While astronauts executed these missions in orbit, engineers on the ground worked tirelessly on the systems that would power humans to the moon. The Saturn rockets were at the center of this effort. Von Braun and his team developed the Saturn I, then the Saturn IV, and ultimately the Saturn V, and a massive rocket that would deliver the Apollo spacecraft to lunar orbit. Each version had to undergo countless tests. Every valve, every engine, every electronic system had to function perfectly. There was no room for partial failure. A single malfunction could destroy the spacecraft and kill the crew. The Saturn V, in particular, represented an engineering challenge unlike anything built before. Standing 363 feet tall and producing 7.6 million pounds of thrust, it was a machine born of ambition and fear in equal measure. Engineers designed its stages to work in perfect sequence. The F1 engines in the first stage were so powerful that they produced vibrations that could tear the rocket apart if not carefully managed. Countless simulations and tests were performed to identify and fix the problem. Every bolt, pipe, and wire was analyzed for the slightest weakness. The Saturn V had to be strong, reliable, and predictable despite its size and complexity. While hardware development progressed, NASA also built the infrastructure required to support lunar missions. Launch Complex 39 at Cape Kennedy, the Vehicle Assembly Building, Mission Control in Houston, astronaut training facilities, tracking stations around the world, and deep space communication networks were all constructed during this time. The scale of the expansion was unprecedented. It required coordination across industries, universities, military branches, and private contractors. The entire country became involved, directly or indirectly, in the effort to land humans on the moon. Astronaut training also intensified. The Apollo crews had to master spacecraft systems, perform simulations, study geology, practice extravehicular activities, and train for emergency scenarios. They practiced docking in simulators, learned to fly the lunar module, and rehearsed procedures repeatedly until they became instinctive. Many astronauts came from military aviation backgrounds, but the skills required for Apollo were unlike anything they had experienced. By the mid-1960s, Gemini flights demonstrated that the United States had mastered many of the techniques needed for the moon landing. But these achievements did not diminish the sense of urgency. Soviet advances were always on NASA's mind. Rumors circulated that the USSR was working on its own lunar program. Intelligence agencies spotted large rockets under development at Baikonur. Although the Soviets were not as open about their progress, NASA assumed the worst. They believed the Soviet Union could attempt a lunar landing at any time. The pressure to succeed intensified. NASA began planning the early Apollo missions. Apollo 1, originally designated AS-204, was intended to be a ground test of the command module. The astronauts assigned to the mission, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were experienced, dedicated, and aware of the risks. The Apollo spacecraft was far more complex than Mercury or Gemini. It had an extensive array of electronics, life support systems, and communication equipment, but complexity brought danger. On January 27, 1967, during a routine test on the launch pad, tragedy struck. A spark inside the spacecraft ignited flammable materials in the cabin. The pressurized pure oxygen environment turned the fire into an inferno. The hatch could not be opened quickly. Grissom, White, and Chaffee were trapped. They lost their lives within minutes. The disaster shocked the nation and shattered NASA's confidence. Critics questioned whether the United States could safely send humans to the moon. The future of Apollo was suddenly uncertain. Yet the tragedy forced NASA to confront its weaknesses. Investigations revealed design flaws, procedural gaps, and communication failures. The agency took responsibility, halted operations, and redesigned the Apollo command module. Safety became a core principle. Engineers worked tirelessly to rebuild trust in their systems. The fire had exposed the program's vulnerabilities, but it also strengthened NASA's resolve. The astronauts' sacrifice became a reminder of what was at stake. By the time Gemini ended in late 1966, the United States had achieved most of the skills required for lunar missions. The nation had matured technologically, scientifically, and psychologically. Apollo would become the final test, the moment when all the lessons, breakthroughs, and sacrifices converged. The road to Apollo had been long, difficult, and filled with uncertainty. But America was now closer than ever to fulfilling Kennedy's promise. The next steps would bring humanity to the edge of the impossible. The early Apollo missions were ready to begin, each one building toward the ultimate objective. The moon was no longer a distant vision. It was becoming a destination. With a turning point, by the beginning of 1969, the Apollo program stood on the edge of a new era. The failures, the fire, the redesigns, and the near collapse of NASA had hardened the agency into something different from what it had been at the start of the decade. The lessons learned through tragedy had created a culture defined by discipline and precision. The engineers now approached every component with skepticism, every number with caution, and every decision with the understanding that human lives depended on perfection. The moon was closer than ever, but the remaining steps were the most dangerous. The mission required not only technology, but unshakable confidence in that technology. The redesign of the command module had proven successful during Apollo 7. The daring orbit of the moon during Apollo 8 had demonstrated that the United States could compete at the highest level. But the next stage required a machine that had never been tested with humans, the lunar module. Built by Grumman, the vehicle looked fragile, almost skeletal, with spindly legs and thin walls barely strong enough to hold internal pressure. It was a craft designed to fly only in the vacuum of space. No wind, no atmosphere, no aerodynamic lift. The astronauts who flew it would depend entirely on its delicate thrusters, guidance systems, and computer. Apollo 9 was selected to perform the first full test of the lunar module in Earth orbit. The crew, James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell "Rusty" Schweickart, trained intensely for the mission. They needed to understand not only the mechanics of the lunar module, but also the psychological shift required to operate a craft that behaved differently from anything humans had flown before. The lunar module was not sleek. It was not fast. It was a machine built for a single purpose: to descend from lunar orbit, land gently on the surface, and then lift off again to rendezvous with the command module. When Apollo 9 launched in March 1969, NASA watched with nervous anticipation. The Saturn V rocket performed flawlessly. Once in orbit, the crew separated the lunar module from the command module and began testing its systems. Schweickart experienced motion sickness early in the mission, raising concerns about whether astronauts could adapt to long-duration operations in a spacecraft without windows or stabilizing reference points. Despite this, the crew pressed forward. They ignited the lunar module's descent engine, verified control systems, and practiced maneuvers critical for the upcoming lunar landing. The most important demonstration was docking, the ability of the lunar module to separate and reconnect with the command module. The mission succeeded in proving the mechanics needed for a moon landing. Apollo 9 gave NASA confidence that the true rehearsal for the lunar landing would be Apollo 10. The mission was designed to do everything Apollo 11 would do except land. The crew, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan, would take the lunar module to within miles of the moon's surface. This mission would test the navigation, descent procedures, and abort capabilities that would decide whether humans could land safely. When Apollo 10 launched in May 1969, the world watched closely. The spacecraft entered lunar orbit, and Stafford and Cernan moved into the lunar module. They separated from the command module and descended toward the surface, reaching an altitude of just 8 miles above the moon. The gray terrain, filled with craters and boulders, stretched beneath them. For a moment, they saw the landing site that Apollo 11 would target months later. The descent was flawless until a sudden malfunction caused the lunar module to roll uncontrollably. The guidance switch had been incorrectly set. The spacecraft twisted violently, and the astronauts struggled to regain control. One wrong move would have sent the module crashing into the lunar surface. Stafford acted quickly, overriding the automatic system and stabilizing the craft. The moment was brief, but the stakes were enormous. The crew narrowly avoided disaster. The near catastrophe served as a reminder that even the smallest human or mechanical error could destroy the mission. Yet Apollo 10 demonstrated that the lunar module could operate in lunar orbit, and that the procedures for rendezvous and ascent were sound. NASA now believed it had the knowledge and hardware to attempt a landing. Meanwhile, Soviet efforts to reach the moon were faltering. The N-1 rocket, designed to rival the Saturn V, suffered repeated catastrophic failures. Intelligence reports suggested that the Soviet lunar program was disorganized and politically strained. Engineers lacked clear leadership. The heavy-lift rockets could not achieve stable flight. The death of Sergei Korolev had left a void the USSR struggled to fill without him. Their program experienced delays, internal conflict, and technical breakdowns. Although the Soviet Union maintained secrecy, the failures could no longer be entirely concealed. In contrast, NASA's renewed momentum was visible to the entire world. By mid-1969, the United States had reached a decisive turning point. The Saturn V rocket had proven itself. The command module was reliable. The lunar module had passed its tests. The astronauts were trained. The support infrastructure was ready. The world's tracking networks, computers, engineers, and controllers were aligned for one purpose. The space race had shifted. For the first time, America held the advantage, but the final challenge remained. The most dangerous, complex, and uncertain mission in human history was approaching. Every previous flight had built toward a single objective: to land on the moon and return safely. The entire program had been shaped by ambition, fear, sacrifice, and persistence. Now all that remained was execution. NASA selected Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins as the crew of Apollo 11. They trained endlessly, practicing landings, rehearsing emergencies, and studying lunar geology. Armstrong's calm demeanor, Aldrin's analytical precision, and Collins's technical expertise formed a balanced crew capable of handling unpredictable challenges. The responsibility they carried was immense. Their success would define the future of American space exploration. Their failure would be remembered forever. Engineers worked around the clock to prepare the Saturn V. Every component was inspected, re-inspected, and tested. The lunar module underwent final evaluations. Mission Control ran simulations that recreated every possible failure: computer errors, communication loss, fuel leaks, navigation mistakes. The team practiced until they could respond to crises instinctively. As summer approached, everything pointed toward one moment. The tension was global. Allies hoped for success. Rivals watched with caution. Scientists anticipated discoveries that would redefine the understanding of the moon. Children dreamed of worlds beyond Earth, and those alive at the time would remember exactly where they were when the attempt was made. The space race had entered its final phase, shaped by triumphs and tragedies, driven by politics and ambition, and sustained by the courage of those willing to take extraordinary risks. Apollo 11 would not only attempt something unprecedented, would test the limits of human ability, endurance, and ingenuity. The world was preparing for history. The moon gamble Apollo 11 was not simply another mission. It was the culmination of a decade of triumphs, Failures, redesigns, and determination held together by engineering genius and human courage. Yet despite the confidence gained from Apollo 8, 9, and 10, the final step remained filled with unknowns. No simulation, no test, and no rehearsal could perfectly replicate what Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were about to attempt. The moon was unforgiving. It offered no atmosphere, no margin for error, no second chances. The world believed NASA was ready. Inside NASA, the truth was more complicated. They knew how much could go wrong. Every component of the Apollo 11 mission had been tested, but none had been tested under the exact conditions of a lunar landing. The lunar module had flown only a handful of times in space. Its fragile structure and complex thrusters had worked so far, but the margin for failure was thin. The descent engine, the most critical piece of hardware in the landing phase, had never been fired in a real vacuum with lunar gravity below it. Simulations suggested it would work. Data supported it, but the moon was not a simulator. Even the computer that would guide the landing, the Apollo guidance computer, was a technological marvel but limited in capability. It had only a fraction of the processing power of a modern calculator. Yet it would be responsible for interpreting navigation data, adjusting descent rates, and keeping the spacecraft stable. Engineers trusted the code, but they also feared that an unexpected overload could cause alarms, resets, or even complete failure. The computer had performed well in previous missions, but the landing profile was more intensive than any previous task. The atmosphere around NASA grew tense as the launch date approached. Engineers reviewed every line of code, checked every valve, and studied every subsystem. The astronauts rehearsed operations repeatedly, practicing landings in simulators that tried to mimic the strange behavior of lunar flight. In Houston, mission controllers ran through failure scenarios that tested their reactions to emergencies ranging from engine malfunctions to communication loss. The room had to operate as a single unit. If even one person froze at the wrong moment, the mission could be lost. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969. The Saturn V rocket lifted off with a thunderous force that shook the ground for miles. Millions of people watched as the rocket climbed through the sky. To the public, the launch looked flawless. Inside NASA, the flight dynamics teams monitored every vibration, every pressure change, and every engine reading. The rocket performed as expected, and soon the spacecraft was on its way to the moon. The three astronauts settled into their routine. Armstrong and Aldrin studied the landing procedures, reviewed maps of the lunar surface, and inspected systems inside the lunar module. Collins checked the command module-less equipment and ensured that he would be ready to support the descent from lunar orbit. While the world celebrated the progress, NASA focused on calculations, trajectory adjustments, and system checks. The spacecraft traveled over 200,000 miles through the cold vacuum of space, each mile revealing the moon in greater detail. When Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit, the crew saw the moon up close for the first time. Its surface was harder, more rugged, and more complex than any photograph had ever shown. Craters stretched across the horizon. Shadows created illusions of shapes and slopes. The astronauts examined their landing site, the Sea of Tranquility, studying it for obstacles that could jeopardize the mission. The lunar module, Eagle, separated from the command module on July 20th. Inside the lander, Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for descent. The moment was surreal. They were inside a machine that resembled a collection of thin panels, wires, and metal sheets, descending toward a place no human had ever touched. Collins watched from the command module, following their path and ready to handle emergencies if they occurred. Yet he understood the truth. If the lunar module failed during ascent, he would return to Earth alone. As Eagle began its descent, everything seemed normal until unexpected alarms triggered. The guidance computer reported program alarms, numbers that the astronauts had been trained to recognize but had hoped never to see. The alarms indicated that the computer was overloaded, receiving more data than it could immediately process. Engineers on the ground quickly assessed the situation. The alarms did not require aborting the mission, but they demanded attention. Armstrong and Aldrin pressed forward. As they neared the landing site, Armstrong saw that the computer was guiding them toward a crater filled with boulders. Landing there would be fatal. Armstrong took manual control of the lunar module. He shifted the craft horizontally, searching for a safer spot. Fuel levels began dropping rapidly. Mission Control monitored the readings and warned the astronauts about the diminishing supply. Armstrong focused entirely on the lunar surface. Aldrin called out altitude and velocity updates while keeping an eye on the instruments. The landing profile was dangerously tight. The lunar module hovered above the surface longer than planned. Each second consumed precious fuel. Controllers in Houston grew quiet as they saw the fuel gauge falling. The margin narrowed 2 seconds. If the fuel ran out, the lunar module would crash or be forced to abort in a chaotic emergency ascent. Armstrong's hands remained steady. He guided the craft downward, using short bursts of the engine to control speed. Dust began to rise beneath them, making visibility even worse. With only moments of fuel remaining, the lunar module touched the surface gently. The engine shut down. Silence filled the cabin. Armstrong looked at the readouts, confirming they were stable. Aldrin monitored pressure and system status. Mission Control waited for confirmation. The message came. They had landed. The descent had been successful, but NASA knew how close it had been. Had Armstrong hesitated, misjudged a slope, or failed to notice the boulder field, the outcome would have been catastrophic. The moon landing had been achieved by a razor-thin margin, a testament to skill, training, and composure under pressure. The world erupted in celebration, but NASA understood how dangerous the mission had been. They knew that the ascent back to lunar orbit presented a new set of risks. The lunar module's ascent engine had never been fired on the moon. If it failed to ignite, the crew would be stranded forever. Engineers had debated this scenario for years. The ascent engine had no backup. Its reliability depended entirely on a simple design and rigorous testing. Armstrong and Aldrin conducted their moonwalk knowing the risk. They planted experiments, collected samples, and photographed the desolate landscape. Meanwhile, Collins orbited above, waiting for the moment when Eagle would rise to meet him. He understood the burden placed upon him. If the ascent engine failed, he would be the last person to see his crewmates alive. At the scheduled time, Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for ascent. They pressurized the cabin, secured themselves, and activated the ignition sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. Mission Control held its breath. Then the ascent engine fired. The lunar module lifted off the surface. Eagle rose into lunar orbit and rendezvoused with Collins in the command module. The docking was precise and calm, despite the enormous stakes. The crew reunited, still processing what they had achieved. With the lunar landing complete, the mission entered its final stage, the return to Earth. As Apollo 11 began its journey home, NASA finally allowed itself a measure of relief. But the danger was not over. Re-entry posed another risk. The capsule had to withstand the intense heat generated by its high-speed return. If the angle of re-entry was off by even a few degrees, the spacecraft would burn up or skip off the atmosphere entirely. The command module re-entered Earth's atmosphere, glowing with heat and plasma. Communications blacked out temporarily. Controllers waited anxiously for the signal to return. Finally, the radio crackled with the crew's voice. The parachutes deployed. Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. The moon gamble had succeeded. But the success came dangerously close to failure at every step. Apollo 11 proved that perseverance, preparation, and courage could overcome the unknown. It stood as a moment when humanity extended its reach beyond Earth. Despite the risks, the mission was complete. But the story of the space race was not over. The sacrifices, triumphs, and consequences would shape the future. The triumph and the cost of Apollo 11's safe return to Earth marked the climax of a journey that had reshaped the technological, political, and emotional landscape of the Cold War. The world celebrated the achievement as a victory not only for the United States, but for humanity. Yet beneath the cheers, the images, and the triumphant headlines, there existed a quieter, more complex story. The landing was a triumph, but it came at a cost one measured not only in dollars or time, but in sacrifice, risk, and the psychological burden carried by those who made it possible. When Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, they were greeted as heroes. Naval recovery teams rushed to their capsule. The astronauts emerged in biological isolation suits, unsure of whether lunar pathogens might exist. They were placed into a mobile quarantine facility and transported back to land. On television screens across the world, they appeared calm and composed, answering questions with precision. But privately, the magnitude of their achievement was overwhelming. They had survived one of the most dangerous missions in human history. The moon landing instantly altered global perception. The United States was no longer playing catch-up. It had surpassed the Soviet Union in the most symbolic competition of the era. Flags were raised, speeches were made, crowds filled streets in New York, London, Tokyo, and countless other cities. Yet NASA scientists and administrators reminded themselves that the success had come with razor-thin margins. The landing had been seconds from abort, the ascent engine had been a singular point of failure, and the re-entry conditions had to be nearly perfect. The mission's success felt both monumental and fragile. Inside NASA, the triumph triggered a mixture of relief and pride as well as exhaustion. Bud soon struggled with depression and the difficulty of finding purpose after having reached such a historic peak. Collins, often overshadowed by his crewmates, quietly reflected on his unique experience orbiting the moon alone. Knowing he would have been the sole survivor if the landing had failed, the cost of Apollo 11 went far beyond individual experiences. Financially, the Apollo program had consumed roughly $25 billion, an unprecedented investment that reshaped national budgets and priorities. Nations that had once questioned American leadership now praised its achievements. The world saw the United States as capable of solving seemingly impossible problems. The landing demonstrated not only technological superiority, but also organizational ability at a scale never before attempted. It altered diplomatic relationships, shifted public sentiment, and strengthened alliances. Yet even as the world celebrated, the Soviet Union reacted with silence and introspection. There were plans for additional landings, scientific exploration, and technological development. But there were also questions. How long would public interest last? How much funding would Congress provide? Would the nation continue pushing outward, or would it treat Apollo 11 as the climax of an era? For the astronauts, the cost extended into personal lives. The pressure to perform in the public eye, the endless interviews, the travel, and the sudden global attention created challenges they had not been trained to handle. They returned to ordinary life with extraordinary expectations placed upon them. Some embraced the role, others struggled with the transition from monumental achievement to daily routine. In mission control rooms, engineers reviewed data from the mission obsessively. They studied the computer alarms, the fuel consumption, the lunar terrain complications, and the descent profile. They understood how close the mission had come to disaster. These lessons shaped future missions, helping NASA improve procedures and reduce risks for subsequent Apollo flights. The story of Apollo 11 was not merely a story of success. It was a story of effort, sacrifice, vulnerability, and determination. The triumph was undeniable, but it had been purchased with enormous costs: lives lost in testing, careers dedicated to a single goal, families placed on hold.